All right, so our final shapes exercise to sort of wrap up the stuff that we did last week with one example from this week is going to be to do what we're sort of calling following a trim path. So what do I mean by that? Well, we have this line in my animation, and I'm going to drag the mouse because the frame rate is so bad. It basically flies across, does a little curve around there, a nice little curvy organic sort of move there, swooshes up and leaves, and then comes back again and repeats the whole pattern again. And we basically end up with this looping thing like this. Now, one thing you'll notice is I have actually kept moving on my timeline in the comp. I haven't even reached the sort of loop point here, and it was already looping. This whole thing has only two keyframes, but applied to two different things. So basically 2 tracks of 2 keyframes apiece. So 4 keyframes got us this entire animation, and it's looping. And I'm going to show you how we did that. And I am going to create a new composition. New composition. I'm still working in 1920 1080. However, my settings are different in this one. That's not what I want. I'm going to change my frame rate to 23976 because that's what I originally had it on, but it got changed because of something else. Black background's fine. All this is fine. I'm going to call my comp trim path, but I'm going to put I've got several of them, so I'm going to put a 4 at the end of mine, but you don't have to do that. Trim path. All right, and I've got a new comp ready for me to work within. So you'll notice that when we look at the one I already was doing, I have one layer. Not too much of a surprise, right? Because we only see one thing flying around the screen, but that's also encouraging because that means we're not going to have to build a whole bunch of stuff down here. And you'll notice it is a shape layer. So let's do that. We're going to, on our new comp, I'm going to go to the layer menu at the top. I'm going to go new shape layer. All right. My shape layer pops up. Life is good. Now, we need to do a pen tool trick to sort of draw the path that this thing's going to fly on. All right. Now, I'm going to want to start outside the image. So my window size is set to fit. And I don't want that. I want to give it a little bit of a margin. And at the fit setting, it thinks it can go as big as 41%. So I'm going to go to a number smaller than that, but not too small. So I'm going to go to 33.3. And yes, that gave me a little margin out here to play with, which is good. All right, I'm going to go up to the pen tool, which is also the letter G on the keyboard to activate it. And I'm going to draw a path. I'm going to start outside the image. I'm going to click my first thing. Then I'm going to go to the next area that I want it to go. And I'm going to click the next thing. And if I hold for a second, it will actually let me do a bendy line. Then I can let it up. Go to my next place, my next place, my next one. Maybe I need to start bending it again. Next little bend here. And then I'm going to leave the frame outside of here as well. Okay, so I want a little margin on both sides. Now, once I'm done, if I'm like, ooh, I forgot to make this frame bendy and this one's a little pointy too, I wish I could fix that. You can fix it, but the trick is you have to go and not be on the pen tool anymore. You have to go to the selection tool, the letter V, and then you should be able to click on a point and get the little bounding box up, and you can start to ease these curves out just by clicking. All right, I think when I get stuck like this, what I have to do is I have to convert Vertex tool and click on it. Yep, and then it'll let me turn it into a bending line. The others obviously did it. You saw me do it several times before I had that problem. But if it doesn't work for you, then you got to go back to the pen tool and you got to change it to convert vertex. And that means I'm changing the nature of the vertex. So that one was too much of a harsh vertex and I was able to hold on it and pull it out. All right. So we're not completing the shape. We've made a path, but we're not closing this like we've done on some of the other masking exercises. All right. And there's a reason for that. All right. So the first thing we need to do is we need to actually change some variables on this path. All right. you'll notice here that when this bounding box shows up, I can move the entire thing around, which is kind of nice. So I'm just going to move it down a little bit. Okay, so if I go to my shape layer and I uncollapse it, and I open content so that I can get to the shape 1, and I open transform so that I can see this stuff. There is a stroke section. And when you go to the stroke section, you then can make the width of the stroke thicker to make your line bigger. And let's say we don't want a white line. Let's say we want it to be a different color. There is a color selector here. I'm going to go for maybe a green on mine, just to be weird. All right. And then we're going to make some other adjustments down here in just a moment. But we're not ready to do that. First, we're going to go to the, we're all dealing still in this same shape layer 1. We haven't added any layers. I'm going to go to the top up here where the little play button, it says add, and it's a white circle with a triangle in it pointing to the right. Looks like a play button. So when I click on it, I'm going to change this, or I'm going to add a control called trim paths. The name of our project. Trim paths. All right, so now we actually have some additional controls that came up. This trim paths 1 came up. So if you uncollapse that, you can see the new controls that we just gained. All right, there's a start and an end and an offset. If you take the end, which is at 100%, and the start, and you change these numbers, it will be less or more revealed, just like when we did the paint on text that we did in earlier exercises. So I'm going to go to the end, and I'm going to go back and show that, boom, I just trimmed some of what was drawing on off. And I can go to the start and do the same thing. I could go around here, and I could trim it, and I could come up with a number that I like here. All right. So to have this little dash be about this long, I basically have a difference of 5% from the start to the end position. So we are starting 70% through the animation or through the path, and then we are ending it at 75%. So there's a 5% gap here, and that translates to be this long of a segment. Okay. So why is that important? Well, I had you leave a little margin outside of the front and the back, and this is going to be why. So let's go to the first of our timeline, the very beginning of it, and we know that our magic number is a 5% difference. So let's set the first one to 0, and let's set the end position to 5. And that means that it is a segment about as long as what we saw before, but it is actually tucked out here outside of the box. Now go 2 seconds down, just as a nice round number, okay? Actually, I'm sorry. We got to set a keyframe at the front. If you haven't moved it yet, don't. And if you did, just go back to the front of your timeline and set a start and end keyframe time. Okay, so that it knows that's the starting position. Then go to the 2 second mark in and manually set a new keyframe on the start and end. Only now we want the end to be completely done at 100%. But the trailing sort of in point behind, we want it to be 5% gap from the end so that it doesn't change size as it flies around. So 5 frames back, or 5% back, would be 95%. So when I hit it, now the green line is just outside the frame over here. And if you don't believe me, drag your little line, your timeline back, and notice that it now animates until it leaves frame. So we only set 2 keyframes, technically 4 because we were doing them at the same time on these 2 variables, but that's nothing. And it now will follow that path. And of course, we already know we can go in and change this path. So if you don't like what you did, now that you see the shape of the thing, you could fix it. So we're going to tweak a couple things about this line. So one of the things I don't like is that this line has hard edges on it. So there is a line cap. Yes, line cap Under stroke 1, line cap has a couple of choices. If you change it to round, you get a rounded edge shape here that looks much smoother and much more deliberately designed. It looks nicer. Oops, sorry. So I did that. Didn't change, didn't have to keyframe it, nothing. It just knows round off the edges now, and you get a much more organic looking little wormy shape, which is kind of cool. That is basically another trick because this is a shape layer. You have all these animatable things that we can steal from and we can change stuff. Pretty cool. That stuff we already did. That's just another application of the same basic tricks. Now, what I want to do now is show you how I got it to loop without having to loop my entire animation. Okay. So the way we do that is through expressions. But let's do the start one first. So I'm going to hold down Alt, which is true on a Mac or PC, and I'm going to click on the stopwatch, which seems counterintuitive, right? Because we already set our first keyframe with the stopwatch, but because we're doing Alt, it does something different. And when you click on it, you'll notice that a little sort of command line text data entry sort of field has now opened up for that track. All right. And it is basically telling you you can type numbers and stuff in here. All right. So I'm going to show you what I did on the other, and we're going to steal that same command. So this command is what I use. Loop out. It is a lowercase L, but a capital O, U-T, and then a bracket with nothing inside, or brackets with nothing inside. So let's go back and let's start typing that in this field. So lowercase L-O-O-P, and you'll notice it knows its sort of library of options. And all I had to do is type loop, and these are all the different kinds of loops. So I don't have to remember the whole dang thing. I'm just going to go to the loop, capital O, out with the empty brackets, and then I'm going to click it. All right. And you can actually, I think, put a number in there and it'll loop a certain number of times and then be done. But that's not what we're trying to do. All right. So repetition is our friend. Now we got to do the exact same thing to the end one, the other track that we've made any variables on. So I'm going to right click on that stopwatch. And now I have that option. I'm going to straight, and my cursor's already over there flashing. So I'm going to type L-O-O-P, and there's all my loop choices. And I'm going to click on the one I want. And there it is. And now when I play my animation, it loops and loops and loops way beyond where the keyframes were, and will keep going forever. So I can stop my sort of pattern of, my workspace. I can put a letter N in here to bracket this off, but it doesn't matter. These changes that are happening at this speed are going to happen again and again and again. And again, I looped my whole thing at 6 seconds because I knew my little animation was 2 seconds long, right? Because that's what we set this to, so it works kind of nicely. All right, so that is what's called an expression, where we're using a piece of code to make our animation do cool tricks. And there are a lot of cool tricks that we can do. So if you haven't done it already, you need to download the class media for tonight's class. There is a folder called expressions inside the week 11 media, which is the week we're in right now, week 11 for what it's worth. In there are a couple of things. There is a very commonly used expression in here called wiggle that has its own little PNG that you can see what the command is for. There is a definition of how frequency and amplitude are used, which is what you'll do with wiggle. There is the definition of what an expression, what these little pieces of code are. So that's just there if you ever have to explain it. Or again, a year from now, you open this folder, what the heck was expressions? And then you open the definition and boom, you're back in business. But the two most valuable things in here is there's an After Effects project, and then there's a document with a bunch of popular expressions there for you to copy and paste and use as you want. And as you can see, some of them are really complicated. They're pretty nuts. I don't expect you to completely understand them. Just know they're here and know that we've given you some of the more popular ones. I'm sure you can do a Google search for fancy schmancy expressions, and there's probably oodles of them out there that you can go steal from other people. But these are pretty foundational ones.